Alicia Johnson had always been a hard-working woman. As a single mother, she worked multiple jobs to support her young son, Chris. She had never been in trouble with the law, but all of that changed one night when she was arrested for a crime she didn't commit. The news spread like wildfire: a violent robbery at a local convenience store, and Alicia's face was plastered on every news channel as the suspect. It all started when a store employee was attacked during a late-night robbery. The robber had fled the scene, leaving behind little evidence, but a description from a witness pointed to Alicia. It was a vague description, but enough for the police to make an arrest. They found Alicia at her home, sleeping soundly after a long shift. The police said they had evidence, but Alicia knew they were wrong. She had been at home all night, nowhere near the store. Still, the officers insisted she was guilty. They were convinced by the witness's vague testimony and the fact that Alicia had been seen in the area before. They ignored her alibi. When Alicia's case went to court, it felt like the deck was stacked against her. The judge overseeing her case, Judge Thomas Granger, was a well-known figure in the local legal world. He had earned a reputation for being tough on crime. However, his reputation wasn't just based on being strict. It was also known that he was harsh, especially when it came to black defendants. Many people had noticed that his rulings seemed to favor white defendants, while handing out much harsher sentences to black individuals. Alicia was terrified when she saw Judge Granger for the first time in the courtroom. She had heard the rumors, and now she feared they were true. The trial was short. The prosecution presented weak evidence, but Judge Granger didn't seem to care. He dismissed her alibi, ignored the lack of solid evidence, and seemed more focused on making an example of her. It didn't matter that Alicia was a mother who had never done anything wrong. It didn't matter that she had worked hard to keep a stable life for her son. To Judge Granger, she was just another black woman accused of a crime. The trial was a blur to Alicia. She tried to speak up for herself, but her voice seemed to get lost in the courtroom. Judge Granger's stern face never showed any sign of doubt. His eyes were cold, his decisions final. When it was time for the sentencing, Alicia could hardly believe what she heard. She was sentenced to 125 years in prison, a punishment that seemed more like something reserved for the most dangerous criminals. Alicia's heart sank. She was being punished for something she didn't do. She tried to hold back tears, but the shock was too much. How could this be happening to her? As the courtroom emptied and Alicia was led away in handcuffs, she could feel the weight of the injustice pressing down on her. How had it come to this? A woman with no criminal record, a mother who loved her son, was being sent away for the rest of her life because of a biased judge and a broken system. She had always believed that the justice system would protect her, but now, standing in that cold, harsh courtroom, Alicia felt that belief crumble. All she could think about was her son, Chris, who would grow up without her, and how she had to prove her innocence somehow. But little did Alicia know, the wheels of justice were just beginning to turn, and her father, Mayor Derek Johnson, was about to make sure the world knew the truth. Judge Thomas Granger was a man who had always followed the rules. At least, that's what he wanted everyone to believe. He prided himself on being tough and fair, a judge who didn't let emotions get in the way of the law. But beneath the surface, there was something more troubling. People who knew him well whispered about his harsh judgments, especially when it came to black defendants. They said he was quicker to hand out long sentences to people of color, regardless of the evidence. Granger had grown up in a conservative, small town, where everyone knew everyone else's business. His family had a history of being well respected in the community, and from a young age, Thomas had been taught the values of hard work, discipline, and order. As he grew older, those values turned into something darker, values that allowed him to separate his sense of fairness from his personal prejudices. When Thomas Granger became a judge, he quickly climbed the ranks, gaining recognition for his tough stance on crime. He made headlines for being stern in court, and many saw him as a symbol of the justice system's strength. But there was a darker side to his reputation that the public didn't see. Granger had a tendency to show little patience for people who didn't fit into his view of society. He believed that people who committed crimes, especially black people, were deserving of the harshest punishments. His rulings often seemed based on his own personal beliefs rather than the facts of the case. He seemed to think that a strong hand was the only way to handle crime, no matter the background or circumstances of the defendant. This was no secret to those who had followed his career. In fact, many attorneys, activists, and even other judges whispered about how Judge Granger was known for his biases. When it came to black defendants, his decisions often seemed to be predetermined. Alicia Johnson's case was no exception. When Alicia walked into his courtroom, she had no idea that she was about to face a judge who was not only biased, but who had a history of making life difficult for black people accused of crimes. From the moment she was arrested, Alicia was treated like a criminal, even though there was no real evidence tying her to the robbery. Granger, however, saw her differently. To him, Alicia was just another black woman to be punished. His mind was made up before he even heard the details of the case. Judge Granger's past was a collection of similar stories. Many people had been wrongly sentenced under his rule, but few had the courage or resources to challenge his authority. Granger was seen as a tough, untouchable figure in the courtroom, someone who didn't let anyone question his decisions. But what most people didn't know was that this tough image was all part of the persona he wanted to protect. He wanted to appear fair and just, but deep down, he was haunted by his own biases. In fact, some of the most disturbing rumors about Granger involved his personal life. There were whispers that his biases were not just a result of his upbringing, but also due to his close ties with powerful people in the community. Some said he had been placed on the bench by wealthy and influential families who shared his views on crime and punishment. These families had the money and power to help him rise through the ranks, and in return, they expected him to make decisions that benefited their interests. But despite all his connections and power, Judge Granger had one big blind spot. He didn't know about Alicia's family. Alicia wasn't just an ordinary woman. She came from a powerful political family. Her father was Derek Johnson, the mayor of the city. The mayor had built his career on fighting for justice and equality, and although he kept his family life private, Alicia's case was about to change everything. As Granger handed down the 125-year sentence to Alicia without a second thought, he had no idea that her father was one of the most influential people in the city. He didn't know that Alicia's case would become a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire city. Mayor Derek Johnson was about to challenge everything Granger thought he knew about power, race, and justice. Alicia sat in the cold, concrete prison cell, her mind racing. She had been sentenced to 125 years in prison for a crime she didn't commit, and now she faced the terrifying reality of spending the rest of her life behind bars. But in the silence of her cell, Alicia found a small flicker of hope. She wasn't just any woman. She was the daughter of someone very important. Alicia's father, Mayor Derek Johnson, was a well-known figure in the city. As mayor, he had built a reputation for being fair, compassionate, and a fighter for justice. He had worked hard to improve the city's schools, create better job opportunities, and fight for equal rights for everyone, no matter their race. He wasn't just a politician. He was someone who cared deeply about the community he served. But despite all his achievements, Derek had always kept his family life out of the public eye. He didn't want to mix his personal life with his political career. But Alicia's case was about to change that. When Derek found out that his daughter had been wrongfully convicted, he was devastated. He had always been proud of Alicia, watching her grow up into a strong, smart, and hard-working woman. To think that his daughter, the woman who had always done everything right, was now locked away for a crime she didn't commit, it was too much for him to bear. Derek immediately swung into action. He contacted top lawyers and experts to take a fresh look at Alicia's case. He knew that with the right team, they could prove her innocence. But there was a bigger problem. Alicia had been convicted by one of the city's most powerful and controversial judges, Judge Thomas Granger. Granger was known for his harsh rulings, especially against black defendants, and Derek knew that challenging him wouldn't be easy. But Derek was no stranger to fighting for what was right. Throughout his political career, he had faced opposition from powerful people who didn't like the changes he was pushing for, but he had always stood firm. This time, however, it wasn't just his career on the line. It was his daughter's freedom, and he wasn't going to back down. As Derek began his own investigation into the case, he learned just how deep the corruption in the judicial system ran. Judge Granger wasn't just biased against black defendants. He had a history of ruling unfairly, and Alicia's case was just one example. Derek started to dig into the judge's past, contacting people who had worked with Granger over the years, and he quickly discovered something that made his blood run cold. Granger's rulings weren't just the result of bad judgment. They were part of a pattern of racial bias, of favoring wealthy, white defendants over those who were poor and black. But Derek's investigation went deeper than just the judge's unfair rulings. He also uncovered connections between Granger and some of the city's most powerful people who had helped him climb the ranks to become the judge he was today. These were the same people who had used their influence to keep the system working in their favor, making sure that people like Alicia never stood a chance in court. Derek was furious. He couldn't believe that the system he had worked so hard to improve had failed his daughter so badly. But he also knew that this was bigger than just Alicia's case. If he could prove that Judge Granger was corrupt and biased, it could change the entire judicial system for the better. It could bring justice not just for Alicia, but for everyone who had been unfairly treated by Granger and others like him. Derek's heart ached as he thought about Alicia in that prison cell. He knew she was scared, alone, and suffering. But he also knew that he couldn't let her down. He wasn't going to sit back and let the system crush his daughter. He would fight, no matter the cost, and he would make sure that the truth came out. As Derek continued his investigation, he reached out to activists, civil rights groups, and anyone who could help expose the corruption in the justice system. The fight was just beginning, and Derek was determined to make sure that Alicia's case would be the one that exposed the cracks in the system and brought about real change. As Mayor Derek Johnson dove deeper into the fight for his daughter's freedom, he knew that time was running out. Alicia's 125-year sentence weighed heavily on his mind, and every moment she spent behind bars felt like an eternity. The legal team he had hired was working tirelessly, but Derek understood that winning this battle would require more than just lawyers and paperwork. It would take a full-blown effort from everyone who cared about justice. Derek wasn't just fighting for Alicia. He was fighting for every person who had ever been unfairly treated by the system. He wanted to show the world that corruption could be exposed, and he would be the one to do it. But he knew that this wouldn't be easy, especially with someone like Judge Thomas Granger standing in his way. Granger was not only a powerful figure in the courtroom, but also a man who had built his reputation on being untouchable. With every passing day, Derek's frustration grew. The more he learned about Judge Granger's past, the angrier he became. Granger's history of racially biased rulings wasn't just a coincidence, it was a pattern. Derek began to see the true nature of the system he had spent so many years trying to fix. It wasn't just about one bad judge. It was about a system that allowed corruption to thrive, a system where powerful people could manipulate the law to suit their needs. Derek knew that he couldn't take this fight on alone. He reached out to the local civil rights groups, activists, and anyone who had fought against injustice in the past. The response was overwhelming. People who had never met Alicia, people who didn't even know her story, were now standing beside her. They were ready to take on the system, and Derek could feel the power of their support. It was as if the entire city had come together to demand change. But the road ahead was still uncertain. Granger had powerful allies, and Derek knew that if he wasn't careful, his efforts could backfire. The more he pushed against the system, the more resistance he faced. There were whispers in the media, rumors that Derek was using his political power to try to get his daughter out of trouble. Some people even accused him of trying to manipulate the justice system for his own personal gain. But Derek didn't let those accusations distract him. He knew that the truth was on his side, and he refused to back down. Behind the scenes, Derek's team was working around the clock. They dug deeper into Alicia's case, uncovering evidence that had been overlooked during the trial. They found witness statements that hadn't been presented. They reviewed the store's security footage, and they examined the police reports that had been ignored. Slowly but surely, they were building a case that could prove Alicia's innocence. The more Derek learned, the more determined he became. He knew that this wasn't just about proving that his daughter was innocent. It was about exposing the flaws in a system that had failed so many people. Derek wasn't just fighting for Alicia's freedom. He was fighting to make sure that no one else would have to suffer the way she had. As the pressure mounted, Derek made a bold decision. He decided to take the fight public. He knew that in order to make real change, he had to shine a spotlight on the injustice. So, he called a press conference. For the first time, he spoke openly about Alicia's case, about the bias in the justice system, and about Judge Granger's history of unfair rulings. Derek wasn't just speaking for Alicia anymore. He was speaking for every person who had ever been wronged by the system. The press conference sent shockwaves through the city. People who had never heard of Alicia or Judge Granger now knew their names. The story of a powerful mayor fighting for his daughter's freedom spread across news outlets and social media. It wasn't just a local issue anymore. It was national news. The pressure on Judge Granger grew, and people began to demand answers. Derek knew that taking his fight public was a risk, but he also knew it was necessary. The world was watching now, and he was determined to make sure that Alicia's case would not be ignored. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Derek felt a glimmer of hope. He was no longer just a politician trying to make a difference. He was a father, fighting for his daughter's freedom, and he wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The city was buzzing. People were talking about Alicia's case everywhere, from coffee shops to local news broadcasts. Mayor Derek Johnson's bold decision to take the fight public had opened a floodgate of support and attention. Alicia, once just another nameless person behind prison bars, was now at the center of a movement that was bigger than anyone had expected. It wasn't just about one wrongful conviction anymore. It was about exposing corruption, bias, and injustice in a system that claimed to protect everyone, but often failed the most vulnerable. As the media continued to cover the case, Derek could feel the pressure mounting. On one hand, the outpouring of support was heartening. People across the country were calling for Alicia's release, signing petitions, and protesting for change. Activists were organizing rallies, and even celebrities started to speak out, drawing more attention to the injustice. The movement grew stronger every day, and Derek knew this was the turning point. But with all the attention came new challenges. The public spotlight meant that Judge Thomas Granger could no longer pretend his actions would go unnoticed. The walls of his power began to crack. There was no way he could ignore the mounting pressure. The more Derek exposed Granger's past and the judge's history of bias, the more cracks appeared in his reputation. Granger, a man who had once been untouchable, was now being forced to defend his record. And he didn't take kindly to the growing criticism. Behind closed doors, Granger was fighting back. He dug in his heels, insisting that his rulings were fair and justified, but his defensive attitude only added fuel to the fire. The media didn't let up. Journalists began uncovering more of Granger's controversial past, cases where he had handed down harsh sentences to black defendants or overlooked critical evidence that could have led to acquittals. The pressure on him was unlike anything he had ever faced. He was no longer just a judge. He was a symbol of everything wrong with the system. For Derek, though, this wasn't enough. While Granger's reputation was crumbling, the fight for Alicia's freedom still had a long way to go. Derek knew that it was one thing to expose the judge's corruption, but it was another to get Alicia out of prison. He needed solid evidence that could undo the wrongful conviction. His team worked tirelessly, reviewing every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every document from Alicia's trial. Days turned into weeks, and Derek refused to rest. He kept meeting with lawyers, meeting with civil rights groups, and speaking to anyone who could help. The case had become personal for him, not just because Alicia was his daughter, but because he had spent years fighting for fairness and justice for everyone. Now the fight was at his doorstep. One evening, Derek received a call that made his heart race. It was from one of the lawyers working on Alicia's case. They had found something. A key piece of evidence had been buried in the paperwork, something that could completely change the outcome of Alicia's trial. It was a small detail, but it was powerful. The store's security footage, which had originally been dismissed, had been tampered with. The timestamp had been altered to make it look like Alicia had been at the store at the time of the robbery. Derek's mind raced as he processed the information. This was the break they had been waiting for. The footage was key to proving that Alicia wasn't at the scene of the crime, and if they could show the court that it had been tampered with, the entire case could be thrown out. Derek immediately called a meeting with his legal team. The excitement was palpable. They knew they had just uncovered the evidence that could free Alicia. But they weren't done yet. The fight wasn't over just because they had found new evidence. Now they needed to make sure it would be enough to convince the court. It was going to take more than just one piece of evidence. It was going to take a strategy, a full court press to expose the corruption that had led to Alicia's wrongful conviction. Derek was determined to get this right. At the same time, Alicia was still sitting in that prison cell, waiting for a breakthrough. She had heard nothing from Derek for a few weeks, and the loneliness was overwhelming. She had almost given up hope when, one afternoon, a prison guard came to her cell with a message. It was a letter from her father. In it, Derek told Alicia about the new evidence they had found. He told her to hold on just a little longer, that they were closer than ever to bringing her home. Alicia's heart soared. For the first time in months, she felt like there was a light at the end of the tunnel. She wasn't going to give up. She couldn't. With Derek by her side, she knew that justice was finally within reach. The breakthrough Derek and his team had been waiting for had arrived. They now had the evidence they needed to expose the lies that had kept Alicia behind bars for so long. The tampered security footage, which had been overlooked at trial, was the key to proving Alicia's innocence. It was proof that someone had tried to frame her for a crime she didn't commit. But there was still a long way to go before Alicia would be free. The legal battle was about to enter a new phase. Derek knew they couldn't just show the tampered footage and expect the case to be overturned. They needed a strategy that would leave no room for doubt. The pressure was mounting, not only because of the public support, but because the judge who had sentenced Alicia, Judge Thomas Granger, was determined to hold onto his reputation. Derek understood that the fight against Granger would be just as intense as the fight for his daughter's freedom. With his legal team working around the clock, Derek set out to gather the rest of the evidence that could prove Alicia was innocent. They contacted the original witnesses from the robbery case, the people who had been there and might have seen the real culprit. Some were afraid to speak out, but others stepped forward, willing to tell the truth about what had really happened. Their testimonies, when combined with the tampered footage, began to paint a picture of the injustice that had taken place. Meanwhile, Judge Granger was feeling the heat. His public image had been shattered, but he was not going to back down easily. Behind closed doors, he continued to defend his decision to sentence Alicia. He believed that the pressure being placed on him would eventually pass, and everything would return to normal. But Granger didn't understand the storm that was brewing. This time, the fight wasn't just about Alicia. It was about changing the system that had allowed corrupt judges like him to remain in power. Derek was fully aware of the challenge ahead. He knew that the legal system could be slow and unpredictable. Even though the evidence was on their side, there was no guarantee that the case would be reopened quickly. But Derek wasn't someone who would sit idly by. He had spent his career fighting for the truth. And this was no different. He made sure that his team was prepared for every possible scenario, ready to argue in court and present the evidence that would prove Alicia's innocence. The days leading up to the hearing were filled with tension. Alicia, still locked away in the prison, could feel the weight of it all. She had heard whispers from other prisoners about the growing movement to free her, and the letters Derek had sent gave her hope. She held on to the belief that one day she would walk free, but there were moments of doubt when the weight of the years she had spent in prison felt too much to bear. When the day of the hearing finally arrived, the courtroom was packed. News crews filled the back of the room, and reporters crowded in to cover what had become a high-profile case. The public was watching, eager to see if the truth would finally come to light. Derek walked into the courtroom with confidence, knowing that his team had done everything they could to ensure Alicia's freedom. The time for words and arguments had arrived. Now, it was up to the judge to decide. As the proceedings began, Derek felt the eyes of the courtroom on him. He had been in many high-stakes situations throughout his career, but this was different. This wasn't just about politics or policy. It was about his daughter's future. He sat beside his legal team, ready to present the evidence that could set Alicia free. His heart raced as he thought about the years of suffering Alicia had endured. He couldn't wait to see the moment when the truth would finally be revealed. The prosecutor began the hearing by defending the original conviction, trying to dismiss the new evidence as insignificant. But Derek knew better than to let that discourage him. His team stood strong, presenting the tampered footage and the new witness testimonies that showed the flaws in the original case. One by one, the pieces of evidence fell into place, and the courtroom began to buzz with realization. The moment of truth came when Derek stood up to make his final argument. His voice was steady but filled with emotion as he addressed the judge. He spoke not only as a mayor, but as a father who had watched his daughter suffer for something she didn't do. He called on the court to recognize the failure of the justice system and to correct the wrong that had been done. As Derek spoke, he could see the judge listening closely. Judge Granger had been forced into a position where he could no longer ignore the overwhelming evidence. The case that had seemed so clear-cut in the beginning was now filled with cracks. Derek's words echoed in the courtroom, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of hope. When the judge finally spoke, the room fell silent. Granger's decision would determine the fate of Alicia, and whether the system would be held accountable for its mistakes. The courtroom was thick with tension. Everyone held their breath, waiting for Judge Thomas Granger to announce his decision. Alicia's case had become more than just a legal battle. It had become a symbol of what was wrong with the justice system. All the years of hard work, all the hours spent gathering evidence, and all the public support had led to this moment. Derek sat at the front, his hands clenched in his lap, eyes fixed on the judge. His heart was racing, not just for Alicia, but for the future of justice in their city. Granger had spent the last few minutes reviewing the evidence presented by Derek's legal team. The tampered footage, the new witness statements, the overwhelming proof of bias in the original trial. It was all right in front of him. There was no denying the truth anymore. But Derek knew that, despite all the evidence, Granger had always been a man of pride. It wasn't just about right or wrong. It was about his reputation. And Derek could only hope that Granger would put justice above his ego. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Granger spoke. His voice echoed through the courtroom, cold and formal. He first acknowledged the pressure he had been under, the public outcry, and the weight of the case. Then he turned to the evidence. As he spoke, Derek listened closely, his heart in his throat. It felt like everything had led to this final moment, and if Granger made the wrong decision, it could all come crashing down. But as Granger went through the evidence piece by piece, Derek began to sense a shift. The judge's tone was no longer defensive. There was a hesitation in his voice. It was as if he was realizing the full extent of the corruption and bias that had influenced his earlier ruling. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and for the first time, it seemed like Granger was struggling to justify the decision he had made all those years ago. When Granger finally paused, Derek could feel the air grow still. It was as if the courtroom itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The judge's next words would change everything for Alicia. Granger looked up from the documents in front of him, his eyes scanning the room. "I have reviewed all the evidence carefully," he said, his voice firm, but not as certain as it had been at the beginning of the trial. "There are too many inconsistencies and flaws in the original case. The security footage was tampered with, and the testimony that led to Miss Johnson's conviction was questionable at best." Derek's heart skipped a beat. He knew that this was the turning point. The judge continued, "It is clear to me now that Miss Alicia Johnson did not commit the crime she was convicted of." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as people processed the words. Derek's breath caught in his throat. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. "I hereby declare the conviction of Alicia Johnson null and void," Granger said. "She will be released immediately, and the charges against her will be dropped." Tears filled Derek's eyes as he stood up, his legs trembling. He had always fought for justice, but this was more than he could have ever imagined. His daughter was going to be free. All the years of pain, the endless struggle, the sleepless nights, they had led to this. He felt a rush of relief wash over him, a flood of emotions that he had been holding in for so long. In the back of the courtroom, Alicia's family and supporters broke into applause. Derek looked over at his daughter's friends, activists, and the many people who had rallied behind her. They had all believed in the truth, and now it had prevailed. But even as the joy flooded through him, Derek knew that this was just the beginning. Alicia was free, yes, but the fight to change the system had to continue. The corruption, the racial biases, and the injustices that had led to her wrongful conviction had not disappeared with one ruling. There were still many others who were trapped in the system, just like Alicia had been. Derek wasn't about to stop here. He knew the work was far from over. Alicia, who had been watching from the prison, was informed of the judge's decision. She couldn't believe it. After all these years of being locked away, her freedom was finally within reach. When she was released from the prison gates, the first person she saw was her father. She ran to him, and they embraced, tears streaming down their faces. "I told you I wouldn't stop fighting," Derek whispered, holding her tightly. "You're home now." Alicia looked up at him, a smile breaking through her tears. "I never gave up," she said. "Not for a second." As father and daughter stood together in that moment, they knew that this victory was not just for them. It was for everyone who had been wronged by the system, for everyone who had fought for change, and for everyone who believed in justice. Derek had won, not just for Alicia, but for the people who had trusted him to bring about the change the city needed. The courtroom may have released Alicia, but the real fight for justice was only just beginning. Derek knew his journey wasn't over. But for now, he could finally breathe, knowing that his daughter was free.